Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second meeting of 2025 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is a decision to take item 4, a paper by the Clerk, on the New Deal for Business in private. Are members content to take this item in private? Okay, thank you very much. Our next item of business is the fourth evidence session of an inquiry into city, region and regional growth deals. We'll hear evidence from two witness panels this morning. Firstly, from the Secretary of State for Scotland and then from the three enterprise agencies. So I'm delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Ian Murray, Secretary of State for Scotland, the first member of the new UK Government to give evidence to this Parliament, and Alistair MacDonald, Deputy Director for Policy from the UK Government. As always, I'll make an appeal for members and witnesses to keep their questions and answers as concise as possible. And I now invite the Secretary of State to make a brief opening statement.
Okay, well, good morning, Convener. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Scottish Parliament, and a happy new year to all the committee members and yourself and your clerks. And really delighted to have the invitation, particularly to talk about something that is close to all of our hearts and something that I think cross-party we can all agree on is a very positive thing in terms of city, region and growth deals and the programme in Scotland. So firstly, I'd like to just remind the committee that the Prime Minister's #1 priority for this new UK Labour government is economic growth, and regional growth plays a key part in that. If you seen the plan for change that the Prime Minister launched at the tail end of last year, it was all about a plan for change, a plan for growth, and about local growth being a key part of that, regional growth being the key strand that runs through it. Since coming into government, we've obviously signed the two final growth deals in Scotland, the Argyll and Bute growth deal with £25 million, and of course the £100 million enhanced Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal that was the Falkirk deal, but was changed to the Falkirk and Grangemouth deal with £20 million of extra funding, given the particular issues that are happening at Grangemouth at this moment in time. We've also committed through the budget £840 million to dozens of new investment zones, including free ports, local growth projects, and of course the Towns Fund, which many members in this committee will be very much aware of. And that was part of a total commitment of £1.4 billion extra confirmed by the Chancellor in the budget on the 30th of October. It was also part, of course, of the £4.9 billion extra to the Scottish budget, the largest settlement in the history of devolution, and that sits alongside a whole host of other investment opportunities and funds, the National Wealth Fund, GB Energy being the two most prominent. But getting back to the deals, of course, they support that economic growth. They are creating jobs. They're giving that sustainable development across the country. And I think the most important thing from our perspective is that these deals have been grassroots up. So they've been coming from local communities through local authorities and been a genuine partnership between the Scottish Parliament and Government and the UK Parliament and Government with local authorities and local stakeholders. And we've seen that across all the deals right across the country. We've all got examples in our own constituencies and our own regions of where this has been a great success. Of course, there have been some difficulties, particularly around capacity of local authorities to deliver which are some pretty big infrastructure projects in particular, but we have had a really evidence-driven positivity in terms of jobs and growth rate across the regions of where these growth deals have been part of that process. The collaborative working, I think, has been something that we should build upon between the Scottish Government, the UK Government and the local authorities and stakeholders. That's something that I think we should take away from these deals as being something that we should expand upon. And that very clear direction of what they're trying to achieve for local communities is one of the things that I think has been one of the main successes of these deals, in the sense that they've created jobs, they've created that economic growth. They've been projects that have come from the grassroots. They've been done in partnership and, of course, crucially, jointly funded, which I think is a key part of making sure everyone has a stake in the stakeholders in these kinds of deals. And that's meant that governance has been very good. We've seen the coming together of local authorities. I just use the two examples of the Edinburgh region deal and the Glasgow region deal, two very different formats in terms of the way local authorities have come together to promote deals, but actually they've both worked for the areas of which they've represented, and indeed We've recently met with Edinburgh and Glasgow in terms of what they want to do next in terms of the process moving on to something else. So a really, really positive thing. We've got all the deals now across the whole of the country. And those partnership deals have been very successful, as I've already said. This all happens in a very challenging economic environment. I don't think we have to hide away from that. Everyone knows how difficult the economic environment has been. The new government has. We knew, and everyone knew, that we would inherit a pretty difficult financial situation. But the key thing in terms of the relationship to this particular committee's inquiry is that we also, to a certain extent in the Scottish context, inherited an industrial crisis as well. If you just look across the board, whether it be Grangemouth, North Sea Oil and Gas, Mitsubishi Electric, Alexander Dennis, Harland and Wolff, the number of industrial problems that have risen over the last 6 months or so have been considerable in the Scottish context, and I hope that the growth deals play a part in being able to resolve some of those particular issues. But it's clear that we have to deal with both an economic crisis, a crisis in public finances, and also an industrial crisis in the Scottish context, and that is the backdrop to where we are in terms of what happens next. And just finally, convener, in my opening remarks, I suppose what does happen next is the spending review at UK government level, which commences at the end of February and will conclude in April with a statement to the House of Commons in June, and that will set the spending frameworks for where the next stages of local growth goes in the coming years, but that sits alongside the £1.4 billion that have already been committed. So there's a very positive story to tell, and I hope that we're able to dig into some of those positive stories this morning.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for those comments. Now, I appreciate that the new government have inherited the growth deal approach. Your opening comments suggest you're happy with that particular approach, and given that some of these deals are very mature, even if you wanted to change them, you couldn't. But does the government propose, particularly given some of the new initiatives that have been announced, does the government propose to make any changes to the way in which growth deals are being implemented at the moment?
Well, it's actually a question for the individual growth deals themselves, because we've been relatively successful in getting the more mature deals through. And of course, the biggest priority for the deals themselves have been that they've been projects that have been brought to the deals from the grassroots. So they're not government projects as such. The joint funding, of course, has been put in, and then the way the deals are structured, it means that it's funded in that joint way. But if you look at what's been achieved in some of the deals across the country, these have been projects that have been coming from local authorities or indeed stakeholders related to local authorities and communities. So changes to deals have happened from the grassroots level through a whole course of things, whether or not people have changed their priorities. Of course, inflation, particularly construction inflation, has been a huge problem. Local authority capacity to deliver and stakeholders' capacity to deliver. So we've been very flexible in supporting deals to make changes if they so wish to do so. But it's not really for the government to dictate what are the individual parts of the growth deals. There are parts, of course, of regional growth that have been reassessed by the Treasuries in terms of value for money, but these are jointly funded, of course, as you know, by the UK and Scottish Government with stakeholders and the private sector as well. So the projects themselves, if they decided they wanted some flexibility, we've been very open to those kinds of discussions, and some of the deals have had that kind of flexibility built in for a whole number of reasons, mainly, though, because of deliverability, whether it be cost or capacity.
Okay. And you mentioned that the Prime Minister's number one priority is economic growth. What evidence is there that the growth deals, particularly more mature ones, have actually delivered that economic growth in their areas?
Well, there's been, measurements done. I might bring in Alistair to go through some of the finer details of the kind of assessments that we see in these growth deals, but tens of thousands of jobs, local economic development, bringing stakeholders together to lever in private finance. I mean, the figures are there for all to see, but the UK and Scottish Government's contributions have been added to by stakeholders and the private sector to give us more bang for our buck in terms of the growth of those deals. So, yes, there's been job creation. Yes, there's been economic development. Yes, there's been regeneration. What's spawned from that in some of the deals is affordable housing, which has been brought on board. The Highlands and Islands deal in particular has highlighted that the fact that they've been able to bring in affordable housing as part of the projects as an addition to their growth deals. So the way you measure each individual deal, of course, will depend on what's in the deal, but in terms of outcomes, the biggest outcome is jobs, and the biggest outcome is that economic development. And of course, it's not just short-term jobs, because the deals are all long-term. Of course, some are more mature than others, but you would hope that economic development would run right through and that jobs growth would continue to go, because a lot of the projects, whether it be the Edinburgh Futures Institute, or whether it be the James Hutton Institute. These are investments that have been made for the future, and therefore you would hope that that growth would continue after the deals themselves have matured and concluded. Alistair.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, committee. Yes, as Secretary of State said, different levels of maturity across the deals programme. Glasgow's into its second decade, whereas we're about to commence on Argyll and Bute. We undertook a review about halfway through the first phase of the Glasgow deal, and we found absolute evidence of growth and job creation. It also found that it needed a bit more time for that to bear fruit. So I think we'll see some of the long-term impacts as we go, but definitely building in that monitoring and that understanding of what works into deals. Everyone has a benefits realisation plan. I sat in on the annual board meeting for the Edinburgh and South East Scotland deal before Christmas, and they had a very sophisticated, very exciting analysis of the impact they'd had across a whole range of areas. For other deals, that they're rightly focused on implementation, getting those off the ground, but we'll see that benefits realisation played in as we go, and there's lots to learn from the more mature deals as well for the ones to come. But yeah, range across jobs, across infrastructure. You can literally see bridges and the impacts they have in terms of joining up communities and Edinburgh Future Institute and other infrastructure. But an ongoing part of deals certainly is monitoring what impact they are having.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Can I bring in the Deputy Convener?
Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us. It's very much appreciated. In your opening remarks, you correctly referenced the wider macroeconomic situation, which is indeed extremely challenging. I can see that you've inherited a very difficult position, but some of the moves thus far arguably have made the macroeconomic picture even more complex and difficult, ultimately potentially leading to stagflation with the tax and jobs in terms of national insurance contributions and so on. In terms of the Chancellor having to look so carefully at where further cuts potentially could need to be made, what guarantees are you able to give on a multi-year basis as to UK government commitment to funding? In other words, do you see that changing as a result of the macroeconomic challenges ahead?
Well, Deputy Convener, as a government, we don't comment on individual market movements that we've seen perhaps in gilt yields in the last week or so, but it just highlights how difficult the situation that we inherited is, and I don't think we have to be too shy about reminding people of that. The inheritance was always going to be the worst economic inheritance of any incoming government in peacetime since the Second World War.
Of course, whereas a result of recent movements, I concede there's other factors at play in terms of the wider global economy, but one element of bond yields is confidence in policy at the UK government level. That's one element of it amongst many.
Well, the bottom line here is that, and you represent the governing party here at the Scottish Parliament, is that when you're in government, you can't just wish away what the situation is that's in front of you. And we inherited a pretty bad economic situation, a crisis in industry as well in the Scottish context, but partly across the UK too, and a £22 billion black hole that we didn't know about. Now, when the Chancellor gets the dispatch box to deliver a budget, that's the situation she has to deal with. She can't just wish that away. And therefore, that hole had to be plugged. It had to be plugged early in order to try and give that stability in the economy. And that means some pretty tough and difficult decisions. But we're honest about that with the public at the election. And it has been made much worse by what we found since we came into government. So the bottom line here is that decisions had to be made. Money had to be raised, of course, through taxation, £40 billion of extra. But that's given extra spending as well to end austerity, which is what we promised. And the additional money, for example, into the deals, the £1.4 billion, and of course the largest settlement in Scottish parliamentary devolution history, is part of the spending that comes from the increase in taxation. So the challenge to all of us, but particularly the challenge to questioning of that, which I think is an important thing to challenge and scrutinise government on, back would have to be, if we didn't make those decisions, what other decisions would we make, or what spending would you like cut? And that's really difficult when you want to invest, as this inquiry is looking at, in local communities, in promises that were made but not funded, which is another thing that we had to find in the context of this inquiry. There was lots of announcements made with no funding attached. and those difficult decisions had to be made. We've now found that money through making difficult decisions to fund our local communities, but that's taken some pretty hard decisions that we've had to make, very, very unpopular decisions in some places, but that's given us stability in the economy, and hopefully now we can build for the future, and the spending review will be part of that process.
You didn't answer my direct question. My challenge is how certain, given your articulation of the UK macroeconomy, how certain can any city and region deal be as to the future profiling and flow of funding on a multi-year basis, given that the Chancellor has been quite clear in leaving no stone unturned to look for the potential for cuts? So it's a chance for you to put on record that the money that has been promised by the UK government over a time period will remain intact. Can you do that today?
The £1.4 billion announced at the budget will remain intact.
I'm talking about the city and region deals.
At the moment, in terms of the money that's been put in, we've given the commitment to the 12 city region deals. We signed the Falkirk and Grangemouth one after the budget in Falkirk, in fact. That £100 million, the £25 million for Angling Butte is done and dusted. The signing of that will be hopefully in early March, when both the Scottish and UK governments can find dates in the diary to come together, so we do that jointly. So that money for those 12 deals across Scotland is secured and is committed. But what is pretty clear, and if you look at the news that broke this morning at 7 o'clock, inflation has dropped surprisingly. So, you know, the economic, that is good news, but the economic situation is challenging. But we all have to lift the mood and be much more positive about the fact that we're heading in the right direction now that we've settled the foundations, and the spending review will be part of that process.
Okay, right, thank you. I wanted to just move on to another topic in terms of the role of this place and this Parliament in terms of the scrutiny of these deals. It's not been certain to us as a committee in what respect the Scottish Parliament has previously had a role in ensuring that the outcomes we all want to see for these city and region deals is positive. What's your sentiment as to the role of this place, and what's your intention in terms of giving this Parliament its place going forward in terms of scrutiny?
I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question on the basis that these deals in particular are jointly funded. I mean, they're jointly funded almost to the penny between the UK and Scottish governments, and it is a partnership between both governments, local authorities and other stakeholders, and investment that's coming in. So the scrutiny of the Scottish Parliament of these deals, I'm sure, is in the hands of the Scottish Parliament. In terms of what Alistair said, with the assessment that's been done already, most of the deals are on track. Some of them, of course, haven't been signed yet, but actually, and the Falkirk and Grangemouth deal is only just beginning to be started, while Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen are very mature and coming to the end of their particular projects. So each individual deal has an analysis that's going on. There's constant contact between the two governments and the deals themselves. So in terms, I can't answer for how the Scottish Parliament wants to scrutinise that, and I'm not quite sure. Maybe you could unpack a little bit the question in terms of how I can provide the Scottish Parliament with more scrutiny of those deals. I'm not quite clear what you require.
Yeah, no, it's fine. You've given your view on the record, and that's helpful. Thank you, and I do appreciate you attending today. In terms, my last question in terms of governance, you correctly point out the fact that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government have a role here. From a purely governance perspective, I've always been a little unclear rather, as to how specifically that works. Generally speaking, in any governance structure, you have one ultimate accountable authority. This is less clear in this instance from a governance perspective. How do you see it working in terms of the ultimate accountable body where funding is coming from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government?
I'll let Alistair give you the details, but as I understand it, and Alistair can correct me if I'm wrong, the accounting officer for all the deals is the Scottish Government. So the ultimate legal authority, if you like, is with the accounting officer, which is the accounting officer for all of the deals is the Scottish Government. The money, as I understand it, goes to the Scottish Government and is then distributed to the deal partners.
Okay. And therefore, in that case, my question equally stands, which I'm not asking for the further response, that should funding be withdrawn from the UK Government at a future juncture due to the macroeconomic challenges we've articulated, that would still remain the case. In other words, the Scottish Government would remain ultimate accountability for delivery, but without potentially funding.
There's no money being withdrawn from these deals because they're signed and some have almost concluded. So that's as big as a guarantee as I can possibly get. But in terms of the scrutiny and the accounting scrutiny of these deals themselves from a Scottish parliamentary perspective, the Scottish Government is the legal accounting officer for all of the deals. Is that correct, Alice?
Yes, that's correct. And there's an annual process whereby HM Treasury transfers the drawdown for the deals programme each year to the Scottish Government as the accountable body, which is then dispersed, as the Secretary of State says, to the 12, soon to be 12, deal portfolio. So that's a well-established, very collaborative process. You know, I would emphasise how intertwined the two governments are on these deals. They are genuinely run in partnership. I co-chair the annual conversations with all 12 deals with my counterpart in the Scottish Government, who reports up through her ministers as I do to mine. Some deals have a greater UK Government funding in them, others have greater Scottish Government funding. So it's a genuinely collaborative and deeply intertwined programme, I would argue, and I think not in UK Government's interest to withdraw from that, nor I think likely or possible.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I bring in Daniel Johnson?
Thank you. So that's wrong microphone. I don't know what the parliamentary protocol is here in terms of declaring interest, or maybe we should just promise to have a conversation that goes beyond the wonders of South Edinburgh. But anyway, Secretary of State, you've already alluded to the very difficult decisions the UK Government had to take on taking office. And I note that there were two deals that were actually paused while they were reassessed and then obviously subsequently confirmed in the October budget. So I was just wondering if you could expand upon both what did you find on taking office in terms of the financial preparations for those deals, and what steps did you and the wider government take to actually assess the deals that were in train and establish that they were good value for money and would deliver on the objective of delivering economic growth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can both agree, Mr Johnson and I, that Edinburgh South is the best place in Scotland, so we can sit and have a chat about that if you so wish, but I'm sure the convener would call us out of order, and there might be some challenge from other committee members. But I suppose, I mean, it's a fundamental question, because we did have to reassess every single penny of public funding. I mean, there was a lot of announcements made in the regional growth area in a Scottish context that had been made, promises had been given, but no money attached. And if I can draw upon two examples, the Towns Fund being one. Many of our towns across Scotland had been promised funding, £20 million over 10 years to regenerate their town centres, but there was no money attached to that. So local communities felt quite sore that these were now having to be reassessed because of the financial situation that we inherited. They were assessed, and of course we've now brought the money forward in the budget, and the £1.4 billion is £840 million of new money in terms of free ports, investment zones and regional growth. So there's a big pot of money in there now to enhance what we've already got. The Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal was fast-tracked before the budget because of the issues at Grangemouth. It was very important to get that through with the additional £20 million, which is a £10 million contribution from each government, as an addition to bring up to £100 million for the Falkirk and Grangemouth deal, to deal with some of the particular issues in that area, which are all well documented. And the Argyll and Butte one was the last one to be done. There was significant issues with the council in terms of having to sign advance contracts for the Rothsey Hall, which was one of the major parts of their project. And they had a big deadline that they had to meet in order to get the cost that they had been promised by the developer to help them with that redevelopment. So we had to try and fast-track that through. Thankfully now all that assessment's been done. the 12 deals across Scotland are now they're all signed, they're all covered with the Argyll and Bute one will be signed in March, and they'll now all start to progress. But as Alistair says, that assessment that's been done is not just a one-off process or an annual process, it's done constantly, because one of the biggest issues that we've found is the significant capacity in some local authorities to deliver this, and that's hardly surprising given local authorities have been under pressure with their own budgets and their own capacities now for well over a decade, and that is now showing through in the ability of some local authorities to be able to deliver what are pretty substantial infrastructure projects with some significant price tags attached.
I mean, obviously, the city growth deals were developed by the last government. I was just wondering if you could outline kind of what different perspective the incoming administration kind of brings and how it views them, and if you could maybe identify if there's any sort of differences in approach as the new administration looks at city region deals and actually where they might go in the future.
Well, I think there's probably three parts to the answer to that. The first thing is that the city region deals is not necessarily a UK government initiative, and given the 12 deals themselves have been developed from the grassroots up, using local partners in partnership with the Scottish Government and indeed other stakeholders like universities and the private sector. That kind of economic growth is very much part of the plan for change, because it's all about making sure there's growth in every part of the country, as the Prime Minister has laid out in that plan for change, and that regional economic growth is a key element of making sure we can drive that. So there's no real political point in terms of the differences that we see in terms of the process. And the reason for that is because it's a genuine partnership between the Scottish and UK governments. That's something we should build upon. The Prime Minister and First Minister have been very clear that resetting the relationship post-election was something that was his priority, both of their priorities, and I hope that the committee have seen that that is now being taken forward. Certainly Civic Scotland sees that both governments are now working together in the best interests of Scots, and that's really, really important. So that partnership is the second element of the answer to the question. And the third one is that it's about growth, which is the #1 priority of the UK government. It's about jobs, which is the #1 priority of the UK government in terms of that growth. And it's about every single part of the country, all four corners of Scotland, but all four corners of the United Kingdom in terms of that economic growth. And that's what these deals deliver. So what has surprised me most since coming into this post with speaking to the deal committees themselves and the way they've been set up is they're really enthusiastic about not just delivering the city deals that they've got at the moment, the regional deals that they've got, but actually what happens next. And they're looking at how they can work closer together, not just within their own regions, but region to region. And that's a really exciting thing in terms of how we can try and drive some growth in Scotland.
I'm interested by the points you're making there in terms of the focus on kind of regional growth. And I think very much I'd take the view that growth is built at that level upwards. And you have an interesting, I think, vantage point, being able to compare across the nations and regions where these city region deals are being deployed. And if I may, I mean, I think that the difference being that in England, these were very much deals constructed to support the creation of combined authorities and kind of metro mayors. And we have a very different context in Scotland. And also, but when you look at the data, there's some quite interesting points. So, for example, if you compare growth in GDP per capita in Scotland, since 2007, it's been about half the rate of Manchester. In Scotland, it's been about 0.5% a year, whereas in Manchester, since 2007, GDP per capita has grown by 1.3%. Likewise, if you look at inward investment, the number of jobs created, according to the ONS, in Manchester in 22-23 was 5,800, compared to Scotland, where that was 3,400. So I wonder if you'd agree with me that we're starting to see quite different economic outcomes, region to region, nation to nation across the UK. And I was wondering what analysis had taken place to look at what the contribution of city region deals was and whether or not the different structures that they're applying to plays a role in those differences.
The comparator with Manchester is really important because that's been done on the morality of Greater Manchester, which is really, really important. And if I can, the deal I know best, because we've taken discussions forward about where things go next, is the Edinburgh region deal. And the two things that have fallen from that particular deal is that the initial fear or the initial anxiety was that the cities would suck up the money and suck up the infrastructure, because that's what normally happens. What's actually happened with the Edinburgh region deal is that Edinburgh's been the smallest part of where it's been delivered. So East Lothian Council, for example, is very enthusiastic about not just the current deal but what happens next. And part of that process in terms of what happens next is that regions are looking for more responsibility and the devolution of powers to be able to deliver it. So Edinburgh looking at what they could do with a much greater impact if they had skills, training and transport. I think it's the three things they're looking for. And the ability to be able to then regionalise that for the benefit of their own circumstances. They also want to work together with Glasgow on sort of connectivity, because if you look at Edinburgh and Glasgow city deals as two units, if you joined them together on some aspects, they would still operate independently, particularly in connectivity with transport as an example. You can see how that sort of Manchester model in terms of connectivity can then be of huge benefit to the whole of Scotland. So I think the development of deals now in terms of the grassroots, what the deals are telling us is they want now the ability and the powers to be able to then take that forward. If we're able to construct a deal that's not necessarily even about cash anymore, but about giving people the responsibility for delivering on those regional powers, then I think you'd be able to see much more economic growth and much more impactful growth, because it will be much more grassroots-led of what individual regions and parts of those regions require, which in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen, for example, are three completely different cities that also have some joint issues they could do across regions as well as interregionally.
Thank you very much. I'll leave that there.
Thank you very much. Daniel, can I bring in Willie Coffey?
Good morning, Secretary of State. Just two questions from me, if I may. One on flexible funding arrangements with the changing economic circumstances we find ourselves in, and one on science and innovation aspects of the growth deals. We touched on the first question a wee while ago. Some of the projects in, for example, the Ayrshire growth deal have kind of fallen off the table. And it's just to ask you, in behalf of your government, would the funding still be in place should new projects emerge that might take up that slack, or would the funding be withdrawn given the circumstances that we find ourselves in?
I think the Ayrshire deal is probably, again, Alistair can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my own perspective, the one that's been the most difficult to deliver. And I think that's for a number of reasons. One is the costs have significantly increased in terms of some of the projects. Secondly, just the capacity to deliver it in terms of the Ayrshire deal itself. And thirdly, the Ayrshire deals required, probably in terms of the context of the 11 other deals, the most flexibility. I'm not quite so sure that flexibility is... the Ayrshire deal partners themselves know where that flexibility needs to go. I'm not quite sure they're clear where they want it to end up. And I think that's been part of the issue. But we're working very, very closely with them. We've worked, the team in the Scotland office and the Scottish Government have worked very, very closely with the Ayrshire Council teams to try and find a way through that. There is no threat to that funding at this moment in time. However, with every week that passes, the funding by nature becomes smaller because of inflation and particularly construction inflation. So I don't know if Alistair wants to give you a little update on the Ayrshire deal, but it has been the most challenging one in Scotland, I think.
Yeah, just to underline that 62 million is not lost. It's being repurposed. I think the two local authorities reached the decision that the space project that they were pursuing was no longer viable. It obviously takes a degree of time and investment to reach that conclusion, and they did so, and the decision to repurpose that was agreed with the ministers across the two governments. We're waiting for and working with the two councils on what proposals might come next. I'm down in Ayrshire in a couple of weeks, in fact, to meet the chief executives of the local authorities. There have been some challenges. On another part of the deal, a key partner withdrew, so there are some other changes required there, but we're working really closely with them to make those the most effective, impactful changes that we can. More to come on that.
Well, that's encouraging that funding still remains there should new projects emerge to take that up. Thank you very much for that. My other question is on science and innovation elements of the growth deals. As you know yourself, a key part of the Edinburgh City deal is the robotics and AI element, robotarium and so on. And as you also know, Edinburgh is well established as one of the leading artificial intelligence zones in the UK. So it's just to ask you on behalf of your government again why you chose Oxford rather than, say, Edinburgh to be the first UK AI growth zone.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about in terms of innovation. In fact, Edinburgh University's had an artificial intelligence unit since 1964, so they're not new at this in terms of what's been happening. Edinburgh will play a key role in the AI connectivity strategy that was announced this week. Again, if I can just take you through the short history of the exascale issue, which I'm sure you're hinting at in terms of your question, Mr Coffey, was, again, it was an announcement that had been made 4 times to Edinburgh by the previous government, and there wasn't a penny attached. In fact, not only was there not a penny attached, but nobody had even asked for the money. So when we came into office, there was a £900 million commitment to Edinburgh University for the exascale computer and not a penny attached, and therefore some difficult decisions had to be made. As we go through the spending review, Edinburgh will play a key part in the AI development, and that's clearly written in the report that was published this week by the Secretary of State. And the Secretary himself has given a commitment not only to come to Edinburgh, to work with Edinburgh in terms of the key role that Edinburgh will play in that future AI connectivity strategy. So Edinburgh's got a very, very bright future ahead of it in terms of that particular element of their own growth.
So there was no money at all behind the £800 million commitment for the supercomputer?
Not only was there no money behind it, but nobody in the previous government had even asked the Treasury for it. Right. So it was again, it was a number of commitments that had been made, and then the government had to come in, and we had, you know, again, others can wish away the problem, but when you're in government, you either have to deal with it or not, and we had to deal with it because it was unfair to continue with a proposal that with Edinburgh University that was unfunded, that couldn't be funded. But I'm hopeful that we'll get there as we approach the spending review.
One of the things Edinburgh did, as I understand it, they've already spent about £30 million preparing for this project. So is there any opportunity or chance that they might get that money back?
Well, actually, there's been additional funding committed to make sure that Archer 2, in terms of the current supercomputer that's there, is life's extended. And I'm hopeful that the investment that's been made will not have been wasted.
Thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Willie. Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just following on from Willie Coffey's line of questioning, you've indicated previously that the funding is safe for the city deals and there's been no money withdrawn from the city deals. But the supercomputer that was going to be built at Edinburgh University was part of the Edinburgh City deal. So what happened to that 800 million?
It wasn't part of the
I'm reading from the submission to the Scottish Affairs Committee because, as you're aware, they started a inquiry into this same area and then had to be cancelled because of the election, and it quite clearly says data-driven innovation programme, which was all about the supercomputer. So you're saying that funding is safe, yet you've pulled £800 million.
No, Mr MacDonald, the exascale investment of £900 million was not part of the Edinburgh region deal. I don't have the exact. I've got the figures for the deals here. I don't have the exact projects, but the biggest investment in terms of university was the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which was about £47.6 million, roughly off the top of my head. There was no exascale; was completely separate in terms of it was not part of the deals.
If what you're saying is that the funding situation that you inherited from the previous government was so bad, then can you tell us where you found the £14 billion for the announcement this week on AI that was made by Keir Starmer on Monday?
Most of that is private investment.
Right, so there's no government money in that whatsoever?
There'll be government money in that as part of the spending review, but the vast majority of the inward investment that was announced this week was private investment. Most of it from America.
So it's all private investment, very little? It's not 800 million being rolled into the AI?
No, the exascale computer issue has been rolled into the spending review as the UK government's contribution to the strategy. The announcements this week that have been made, the 14 billion, the vast majority of that, in fact, if not all of it, I can write to the committee to clarify, but as I understand it, all of it is private investment into AI, mainly from American investors into the UK. I mean, it's a real, it's something we should celebrate, actually, Mr MacDonald, because we have a real opportunity, not just in the UK, but in Scotland and in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee, to be the centres of the world for AI. And that's why there's big investments coming in, because we're well ahead of the game. We have to stay ahead of the game. And that is also the arguments made by the University of Edinburgh in terms of the supercomputing that's required. So, you know, the challenges that sit alongside that, of course, are energy. They're very, very energy intensive, but this is a huge boost to the UK in terms of the future of the position that we have in terms of AI in the world. I think we're second in the world already, and that strategy this week has been much welcomed, and the investment that's come in is a real thumbs up to that strategy.
The supercomputer at Edinburgh University was so important because there are only 2 known exascale computers known in the world, both in the US. The Edinburgh one would have been the 3rd, and it's already been the home to high-performance computing for over 30 years. So it would make sense for that to be located here, yet we're hearing, as Willie Coffey indicated, that the first AI growth area is going to be Oxfordshire, home to Atomic Energy Authority.
I would read the AI strategy that was announced this week more carefully. Edinburgh is mentioned in that. The Secretary of State's given a commitment to Edinburgh, and Edinburgh will play a key role in that entire UK strategy. So we should be excited about that, and I think that whole strategy indicates a direction of travel in terms of the spending review of what may or may not happen at Edinburgh University. But,
do you know the timescales for when it will happen in Edinburgh?
Well, the spending review will be concluded in April and announced in June.
But there will be a list of projects within that £14 billion. Do you know where Edinburgh comes in that list? Is it near the top or at the very bottom?
Well, there'll be a process in terms of the AI zones going forward, and the strategy mentions that and is quite clear about it. And Edinburgh is well placed to be one of those because of its world-class infrastructure that it already has. That's well, and it's mentioned in the report itself. So, you know, let's get on with delivering this. Now, the important thing for that report is to get on now with delivering it. The money's coming in, the strategy is there, it's been welcomed by industry and higher education institutions. So it's now time to get on with delivering it, and that's the key takeaway from the Secretary of State's announcement this week in terms of that AI infrastructure.
So, of course, the cost of delivering any project is impacted by construction inflation. So we've seen since 2020 construction inflation increased by 20%, and it's expected to increase by a further 17% in 2029. You know, all of the construction projects are impacted by Brexit, COVID, conflict in Ukraine, cost of living increase. Yet the UK government's contribution is fixed. So why should local authorities pick up the inflationary aspect, or are you happy to see projects de-scoped because of lack of funding?
I don't think we've seen projects de-scoped already. There's made a little bit of reprofiling. Yeah, well, there's been a bit of reprofiling because obviously money comes in but isn't necessarily needing to be spent at that particular moment in time. We've been working with partners to make sure they can manage their way through that. That was why I gave the Rothesay Hall example earlier, because they had a fixed contract that had to be signed by September. The Scottish Government actually stepped in with their share of the funding in advance of the deal being formally ratified. So there are things that we could be doing as well. I mean, yes, construction inflation is something that we're not really in control of, but actually there's things like planning, regulations, decisions that can be made quicker at local level and at both Parliament's level to get things moving quicker. So I would encourage partners in growth deals who are having problems with delivery to continue to talk to us and to the Scottish Government about how they can make that position.
No funding to meet that gap?
At this stage, no, but I'm not aware of any projects that have suffered in terms of a reduction that have been required because of those kind of factors that you've mentioned. Is that correct, Alistair?
That's good. That's correct, and it is an issue. Especially, you know, in the islands, for example, we've seen some particular issues there. But we're working really closely with the programmes to prioritise within that and to help them manage some of these costs. It's obviously a challenge, and it's across the board. I certainly wouldn't deny that. Just on the supercomputer point, I mean, the whole value of the Edinburgh deal is 600 million, 300 from each, so it is totally separate, although there are some technology aspects to the Edinburgh deal. And I'm speaking regularly to my counterparts at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology and they're very much thinking about Scotland with this AI action plan. The supercomputer is one part, but there's lots of other aspects like data centres, for example, where they're really keen to potentially locate in Scotland. They need lots of energy, and so some of our post-industrial areas are really well suited to doing that. So they're actively scoping out where those might be located and the jobs that would come through that. So there's lots of different aspects of the plan which I think can be beneficial to Scotland.
I'll leave it at that at the moment.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Secretary of State. I just want to ask a follow-up, if I can, on this question of AI, because I was very taken with the Prime Minister's speech on Monday when he set out the government's ambitions for AI, which have a great opportunity. And of course, as we've heard, the Edinburgh and South East Scotland deal includes the very successful data-driven innovation programme. But on the question of the supercomputer, I heard what you had to say about the funding issue. Isn't it the case that at the time of the general election, the budget of the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology was substantially underspent?
I don't know the individual budget of the DSIT itself, but you know, these decisions aren't made lightly. They're not made in order to annoy people or to say, yeah, we can make them, so we're going to do so. These decisions were made because we had to make them, and it's been incredibly disappointing. And the inheritance that we had, Mr Fraser, was something we had to deal with, and this is one of the consequences of it. It wasn't just the supercomputer in terms of exascale. There was the Towns Fund. There was other commitments that had been made in terms of deal funding and regional growth funding that had no funding attached, and therefore we had to find that funding or not have the project. So we've been very clear with the University of Edinburgh in that particular example that the project wasn't cancelled, but it was being reassessed, and we go into the spending review process, which will happen, which is kicked off and will conclude by the summer.
Okay, so as you probably know, at the time the announcement was made in August, it was hammered by people in the industry. Chris van der Kuyl, the businessman and games entrepreneur, said it was an idiotic decision to cancel that project. What confidence can people have that that will actually come back and we will see that development, which is so important to Edinburgh University and the wider economy?
Well, with all respect, Mr Fraser, I think the most idiotic decision was giving promises to the university that were unfunded, because you know you were cancelled. We were having to make these difficult decisions to pause these major infrastructure projects because there was no money to fund them, and that's a very honest thing to have with the industry and with the public. We said we would be honest about the situation. This situation was worse than we thought it was going to be, and therefore that had to be dealt with. And if a promise is made to an organisation to fund something with no money attached, unfortunately, that money either has to be found or the project has to be paused, and the latter is what happened in terms of the exascale computer at Edinburgh University. If you look at what we've done since, we're working very closely with Edinburgh. They've been constantly in touch with DSIT in terms of the impact. We've had Minister Valance has been here. We've had the Secretary of State himself has been here. I know that the Principal of the University has been constantly in touch with our office, but also with DSIT and other partners. So this wasn't the end of the process. In fact, it's the start of what happens next. And we're pretty confident that Edinburgh will play a key role, a central role in the future of not just AI, but big data.
Okay, thanks. Maybe, Convener, I could ask a broader question about city deal funding. Since the change of government, has there been any change in the approach in terms of the drawdown of funding or the checks and balances that are put in at a government level, or is it just the same model that has been followed by the previous administration? Yeah,
well, it's roughly the same model because most of the deals had started already and some were pretty mature. So as Alistair has laid out, the money is drawn down into the Scottish Government budget, and the Scottish Government then allocates that money when it's required, and it's drawn down on that basis. So there is a programme, of course, of drawdown and when it will be required. Some deals have had to reprofile because of some of the pressures that Mr MacDonald has laid out earlier on. But yes, I mean, in terms of the way the money is allocated and the way it's drawn down, it goes through the Scottish Government as the accounting officer into the growth deals themselves, and they've obviously all got different formats in terms of their own governance arrangements and how they're working together, and that then goes into the project. So there's been a little bit of reprofiling because of some of the pressures, also a little bit of reprofiling because of the deliverability in terms of capacity, particularly of some partners. So all of that's had to be a very complex picture, but we're very pleased with progress, and maybe we only have a few outstanding issues. Highlands and Islands has been difficult because of some of the projects, and of course the Ayrshire one that Mr Coffey mentioned earlier on. But in terms of progress, we're pretty happy with the way things are going, given the backdrop of some of the pressures.
We do speak regularly with deals about the governance. We want it to be proportionate. Obviously, we need to ensure value for taxpayers' money from both governments. But equally, we want the deals to be as focused as possible on delivery and growth. So we have spent some time speaking with the deal programmes to look at where we could streamline and simplify and make as proportionate as possible some of our processes, so that we get the information we need, but that, especially for small local authorities, that they can dedicate as much of their time as they can to delivery. So that's an ongoing process for us. And again, we do that very much jointly with the Scottish Government, who share our views on getting that balance right.
Okay, thanks. Just one more question, if I can, Convener. Seeing Secretary of State, as you mentioned, the Towns Fund. So in the area I represent, the City of Perth was due to get some funding for 3 quite important cultural heritage projects in the city. Has that money gone now, or is there still some prospect of that coming back?
As I understand it, no projects have been cancelled. Some discussions have been done in terms of some of the individual projects of value for money. And again, these will be dealt with and addressed in the spending review. In terms of the Perth ones that you'll be well aware of, but there's also the V&A project in Dundee, for example, which was paused. So we've been very clear with partners that these haven't been cancelled, but there might have to be some. There's a value for money exercise going on at the moment, and there might have to be some reprofiling and redesign of projects to fit into some of that new criteria.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thanks very much. Good morning. Just actually on that point, it's a kind of technical question. With the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up funding, does that money go directly to the councils, relevant councils, or does it have to go via the Scottish Government?
In terms of the technicality, are all deals the same? I mean, as I understand, the money goes to the Scottish Government and then is drawn down by the partners when they require it. Of course, every deal has a different governance in terms of the way they've been set up. So some have been more successful than others, but I think that's the process that would always happen.
Yeah, so some of these other funds are managed by other UK government departments, so that's something we can look into and revert if helpful.
I was just interested. We were talking about how the kind of funding flows.
MHCLG hold a lot of these funds because they have the administrative responsibility.
Okay. On the some of the regional deals, and I'm going to use a particular example that I used last week when we had the Cabinet Secretary in. The Corran Narrows crossing the Corran Ferry. Money has been repurposed or reprofiled, I'm not sure exactly the technical term, from that deal to cover infrastructure. From the previous UK government announced that, and the Scottish Government have also done the same in terms of a new electric ferry. Do you have any concerns about the impact that might have on the overall objectives of those city or region deals? That we recognise that circumstances, situations are going to change, but given they were brought in for particular objectives and they're being changed, what concerns do you have on that?
I'm not sure I'd use the word concern, actually, in terms of those particular examples you've given. I mean, what is one of the key components of the deals and the governance of the deals is their flexibility. And because the deals have been developed by essentially the grassroots and partners, we've been very flexible in saying if you do have to flex and you do have to change, then we look at that. It doesn't happen but without a process of properly scrutinising it and going through proper official channels, etc. Because obviously this is, as Alistair said, this is public money and we have to make sure it's spent properly. But because of the way in which the deals work in terms of being regionally focused, then it's really important to allow the partners to have that flexibility if they so require. The Ayrshire one being a prime example of where things have gone wrong, a partner has withdrawn, and therefore we've had to be flexible in terms of what happens next. And in terms of some of the projects you've mentioned, they will all have been assessed again. They won't just have changed without any kind of scrutiny and proper governance.
I suppose one of the concerns that I had, and have certainly been raised by with the local community, is that here is a local council-owned ferry that is now being replaced through a deal that is meant to do something else and different and create something different, rather than perhaps what the funding for it should have come through kind of the usual spending, perhaps the usual negotiations with Scottish Government. And I suppose does that flexibility, is that flexibility so flexible that it's allowing things that should be through everyday or common kind of spend suddenly becoming being used for that?
I don't have that as a direct concern, but I can see why people would raise that as an issue whereby without being too fine a point in it, the local authority funding has been gutted and decimated over the last decade, and therefore I can see why there could be some concerns that deal funding is being used to supplement stuff that should be paid for through normal channels at local authority level. So I can see that, but actually, in terms of these particular projects themselves, it's critical to economic growth and to the areas that have been requiring it, and therefore I don't have any concerns that the deal funding has been replacing day-to-day normal council funding, if you like. But some of the deals have struggled because of local authority capacity, and that capacity has been decimated over the last decade, and that's part of the problem.
If I can just, I know Highlands Islands MSPs, ferries are a big part of what I do, I suppose, and what I focus on. The Fair Isle Ferry announcement, obviously there's been a large increase in costs. The council have made a decision to fund some of that increase in costs themselves. Were there discussions between the Shetland Islands Council and the Scottish Government on perhaps covering some of that additional cost? The original project was going to be around 30 million. It's now 40 to 45.
I might let Asa come in some of the details, but as I understand it, it's all being fully funded in one way or other. So unfortunately, the costs have gone up by so much, but we understood that the ferry was so important in terms of a project. So I think the gap's been covered.
I think in both of these, it's very much led by the local communities as well. They choose to prioritise, recognising that challenge on where the money should come from, have chosen to prioritise some of this infrastructure given its essential nature, as you rightly say.
Did they come back to the UK Government looking for support in providing, helping kind of meet that gap?
As I recall the discussions, I don't think they came back in terms of asking for more resources. I think they came back asking for the ability to redesign the phasing and also to redesign the deal in order to be able to meet the gap.
Yeah, because timings was also, the deadline was also a concern at the time. Has that been reviewed, and has there been kind of support and movement on that?
Yeah, I think it's all been resolved. And in fact, it's resolved to the extent that I think we've had the request in to go up to this soil cutting ceremony or something fairly shortly in the summer. So
right.
I'm confident that project's now motoring ahead, if that's not mixing up too many puns.
Well, there's a good long ferry journey for you. Just lastly, if I've got one thing. I mean, we've talked about ferries in sort of local concepts in terms of Highlands. We've talked about, obviously, the situation. I mean, there is going to need to be a huge investment in ferries, new ferries and ferry infrastructure. In Orkney alone, it was estimated around 800 million. Is that an area that the UK government can see itself being brought into discussions about how that's going to be funded, given the record so far on covering or being involved in some of these projects?
I think it would be wrong for the answer to that question to be no, and therefore, when we progress towards what regional growth looks like in the future beyond these deals, then given they are grassroots and given they've covered both devolved and reserved areas in terms of infrastructure and investment, if that was what the requirement was in terms of a future deal, you would never rule that out because the project would have come from the local area. I think it would be completely wrong. Of course, they would have to go through proper governance and assessment and value for money, etc., 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 because it is public money. But I think it would be completely wrong for any government to say local areas are bringing forward these projects that they want to fund through whatever, and we would veto that on the basis of anything other than it not being a viable project.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks much, Jamie. Lorna Slater.
Thank you, Convener. And I want to thank you very much for coming this morning, Secretary of State. Your predecessor did not accept invitations to this Parliament to give evidence, and we're delighted that you have. So this committee has taken substantial evidence on the benefits of collaborative long-term working between levels of government and industry, which some of these deals have supported, and many of the projects have been grassroots-led and prioritise sustainability and innovation. But it isn't true for all the projects. And in the older region deals, there are some dinosaur road and car-based projects initiated by Transport Scotland, of which the Sheriff Hall Roundabout, which I know the Secretary of State will be familiar with, but that's the one with which I'm most familiar as well. On the same sort of theme as Jamie Halker-Johnson, it appears that Transport Scotland couldn't get this project prioritised or funded through normal means, and so they've turned to the deal. But it is a bit of a dinosaur. It was proposed before any government in the UK had declared a climate emergency, before the Scottish Government had set a target to reduce car kilometres by 20%, and there is a grassroots local campaign against it. So the project's stuck. It's demonstratively not being built. But at any level of government, if you ask why we can't reprioritise the funds, change up the project, it's always, oh, because it's part of the region deal. And that government, everyone pointing fingers, means that we can't change anything. So the question is, how can governments, with our democratic mandates as they change up over time, adjust these longer projects to align with current priorities? Because it just feels like hands are tied.
I mean, it's a good question, but I think I would have been much more accepting of criticism if it was the other way around. And your question, Ms Slater, was why on earth has a regional deal with a governance board that covers local authorities, stakeholders and partners at local level come to you with a project and it's been vetoed for political reasons? The great value of local regional growth is it does come from the grassroots, and therefore, yes, I mean, I fully accept that some of the older deals, lessons have been learnt since, but the two oldest deals have been the most successful so far in terms of its economic impact. And I think, you know, going back to what Jamie's question was earlier, the Sheriff Hill roundabout as an issue, and it's a roundabout I know very well because it's just a very poor golf shot from the edge of my own constituency. Is part of that deal and was part of that deal, but is it something that should have been funded by those responsible for funding it regardless? And then it would have been in the governance structure of normal government processes through Transport Scotland rather than through a city region deal in that sense. So I fully accept and understand and acknowledge your question, but I don't think it's for either government to be vetoing what comes forward in city growth deals because we don't like it, when in actual fact these projects are brought forward on the basis of a proper governance structure. They're properly assessed in terms of value for money, and most of the deals, if not all of them, will deliver on what they've said they would do within the funding envelopes that they have, which I think is a real positive.
Okay, thanks very much for the question. I'll challenge some of the points there that it wasn't brought forward by the grassroots. It was brought forward by Transport Scotland, and it hasn't been able to be reassessed because of the structure of the deal. But I appreciate the answer. On a sort of more positive note, I suppose, I think the Secretary will acknowledge that the newer deals do seem to be a bit more grassroots and focus on that innovation and sustainability. So what next? Will there be a new tranche of city region deals, and what should those look like?
Well, these are the discussions that have started, and what should they look like? It was a discussion we had with the Deputy First Minister and the Edinburgh City Region deal just last week in this building about what they want to see for the future. Yes, of course, everyone wants pound notes because that's really important, but actually they also want the devolution of the ability to be able to deliver things like skills and transport infrastructure in a much more coordinated way. They want the ability to be able to bring forward projects that are much more attuned to local circumstances. Certainly in terms of an Edinburgh and Glasgow context, they want the ability to be able to work together on joint projects to get more bang for the buck, but do that connectivity across the country. So what the future looks like is unclear, but that is a positive, I think, because deals and governance structures are currently discussing what is best for their regions and coming together in terms of what they think would deliver best for their regions, and every single region will be different in that sense. Whether it be Highlands and Islands will have a much more difficult, conversation on the basis that the number one priority, as I understand it from deal partners, is affordable housing and housing infrastructure. That's a very, very different conversation to Edinburgh and Glasgow or Aberdeen, for example.
Thank you, Convener.
So much, Lorna. Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Secretary of State. I want to look at cohesion with wider policy objectives. You've said at the very beginning this morning that economic growth is the #1 priority for the Prime Minister. You said that jobs are a priority. In order to deliver that economic growth, in order to increase the amount of jobs, there has to be business confidence. And, you know, we have seen from the British Chamber of Commerce survey lately that business confidence has plummeted because of the increase to employers' national insurance contributions, for example, which many folks see as a tax on jobs. How are you going to regain the confidence of business to ensure that the likes of the private investment that went into the Aberdeen City and Shire region city deal can be emulated right across the board?
Thanks for your question. Can I just firstly start by saying the Aberdeen City and Shire deal was probably one of the most successful deals from on the ground, not just levering in additional private investment, but in terms of what it's been delivering. And I think the model up there is something that we should be looking at in terms of what may happen in the future, to go back to Mrs Slater's questions in that sense. Look, the #1 priority for business at the election was stability in the economy and public's finances, and what we've tried to do as a government is deliver that. Now, we've tried to deliver that with two hands tied behind our back, and when the Chancellor got to the dispatch box on the 30th of October to deliver the budget, she started with minus £22 billion, so that had to be filled. And our public services were on our knees, and for the first time, I think, in electoral cycles, and I suppose if you look at incoming Labour governments, which is what I represent, so the thing I'm able to talk about, but back in 1997, we came in with broken infrastructure and broken public services, but a reasonable economy. And in 2010, in 1997, this time we've come in with both a broken economy and broken public services. So we've had to take on a pretty difficult inheritance, and that's meant difficult decisions. And fully understand the issues of business, but if we didn't have stability in the economy, there was no future ahead in terms of how to get that growth and get out of this doom loop that we've been in for the last 15 years or so. So it's really important for us to work with the business industry. We're bringing in lots of inward investment. There's been lots done in terms of supporting SMEs in permanent rates legislation in England, for example. And the whole skills agenda is something that's at the top of everyone's agenda, and something we want to resolve. So all of that is essentially what government's had to deal with in the last 6 or 7 months, and that hasn't been easy. So fully understand and acknowledge the concerns of business. I have yet to hear a coherent argument from anyone that says that they want all the spending and investment, but they can't give an alternative of how it's paid for, and that's just the reality of the situation that we're in.
You said that you cannot wish away the problem, and I get that point. However, where I think we have to disagree is that I think that an increase in employers' national insurance contributions, that tax on jobs, is not going to create stability in the economy. But I want to turn to the picture overall of all of the things that are going on. We have the city region deals, and as has rightly been pointed out today, some of them are older now, some of them are just getting off the ground. But above that, we also have the Wealth Fund, we have got investment zones, we have got green free ports. How does all of this tie in together? How does this complement each part? And how do you and other partners make it as simple as possible for business, for private investors to navigate what is quite a cluttered landscape?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the straightforward answer to your question is about unlocking the potential. I mean, all of these individual parts and the elements that you've mentioned all have different remits. I mean, GB Energy, for example, is about trying to achieve our mission for clean power by 2030, and that will be investing, it will be generating. It's set up, of course, in Aberdeen for obvious reasons, and that is concentrating on that mission in terms of getting to that clean power by 2030. The National Wealth Fund doesn't compete with that; it complements it. It doesn't compete with the market; it complements the market. Scottish National Investment Bank is obviously part of that, but very much smaller, so they don't compete with each other either, and dialogue all the time. So. To relate it to your previous question, I suppose the single biggest thing that the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy have done in terms of their capitalisation is send out very strong messages to the market that the UK is open for business and it's a very investable place, and the government are backing the missions that we've put in place, that we have the mandate to deliver after the election, and that very strong signal has gone out. The challenges now, in terms of, as you say, the landscape of it, is deliverability. And the three biggest impediments to deliverability at the moment in terms of a lot of the infrastructure is planning, 1, regulation, 2, and skills, 3. So these are three things that sit alongside the big investment discussions and economic discussions about the big challenges that we now have. And there won't be an elected member in this room that hasn't had discussions with businesses and institutions who want to invest but are stuck somewhere along the line.
I'm going to be a little bit parochial and take it back to Aberdeen. You've mentioned it a couple of times yourself, so let me move that on forward. First of all, in terms of GB Energy, Aberdeen was the natural choice, but in all of this, initially the suggestion was that there would be 1,000 jobs at the Aberdeen HQ. Now that's fallen to 2 to possibly 300. Of course, that sticks in the craw of some of the folk in Aberdeen who believed the initial figures. But you highlighted one of the key aspects and one of the successes of city-region deals, and you stated that the Aberdeen one was slightly different because it was truly built from the grassroots. Many of the projects emanated from the former Aberdeen City and Shire Economic Future Body. It was a deal that was built on, in the main, skills, which is one of the main things that we need to get right. Obviously, that deal is nearing its end of life. What is the UK government's intention? Is there going to be Aberdeen City and Shire Regional Deal Mark II? Same goes for Glasgow. And if there is to be that, are you going to allow that flexibility, that grassroots decision-making to come up with the projects that are required to drive growth forward in my area and others in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point, Mr Stewart, in terms of best practice, and we should be taking best practice from all across the country and implementing that in terms of whatever happens next, and the Aberdeen City and Shire one's a very good example of that. I suppose it sits very clearly with the new industrial strategy. I don't think the UK or Scotland's had a proper industrial strategy now for a long time. That industrial strategy will champion the stuff that we do well. The publication of that will happen incredibly shortly, but it's very much welcomed by stakeholders, by industry and by business and local communities, in fact. And I do reflect on I do reflect on, if I've picked you up correctly, the slightly tepid response to GB Energy, but there's not an elected member around this table that wouldn't have wanted it in their areas, and it's £125 million. It will create. It won't just have jobs directly employed, but it will create jobs. That's what it's there to do. And it was a great disappointment to me that we didn't have cross-party support for that when the GB Energy Bill was going through the House of Commons chamber, and indeed the elected member for Aberdeen South didn't back the GB Energy Bill. So politics needs to come together as well and start backing and talking up the economy, changing the mood, and actually coming together to say these are good things that are happening in Scotland that we should be backing, we should be supporting, and that in itself, in terms of confidence, would help the business community, knowing that both governments are behind strategies to try and improve the economy, but both governments are also working together, not just in partnership with the resetting of the relationship at government level, but we're working in partnership with local authorities, with other stakeholders, with industry, and that feeds into your overall question about what happens next. I would hope that what happens next in terms of Aberdeen City and Shire, as that example, is driven by what Aberdeen City and Shire require. And I would hope both governments would respond to that in terms of not just resources, but powers and responsibility. And as Mr Johnson says, we don't have to look too far to see where that works well. And it's worked well in terms of some of the city deals in Scotland, but in places like Greater Manchester and Merseyside, it's worked incredibly well in terms of delivery for local people.
So what Aberdeen City and Shire requires is just transition. And obviously the Scottish Government has put in play the Just Transition Fund. That, again, is providing investment for the future in terms of skills into new businesses and creating confidence. Would the UK Government consider matching the Scottish Government's Just Transition Fund, because that is really a requirement of Aberdeen City, Shire and Moray?
Important for the people who are involved in the oil and gas industry, but particularly in the region of Aberdeen City and Shire, is to be pretty clear with them that we will be using oil and gas for decades to come, and it's a key component of our energy infrastructure and our energy needs. But we do have as a national mission of government to get to clean power by 2030. It's backed by GB Energy, which is £7.9 billion. It's backed by the National Wealth Fund, which is £8.3 billion, and being capitalised to do that. The GB Energy Bill will be through Parliament fairly shortly. That's been given £125 million in the budget as set-up costs and to get the first projects up and running. So actually, the Just Transition Fund from the Scottish Government is very welcome, but the UK Government's also doing our bit in terms of making sure we can get to clean power for a whole number of reasons, about energy security, about bringing down bills, but mainly in terms of the context of your question, future careers and jobs in that region all over the UK.
I take it that that's a no then. You wouldn't match the Scottish Government's
Well,
Just Transition Fund?
I don't have a calculator in front of me, but I think I perhaps mentioned £17.5 billion worth of investment that is currently available for projects to get us to clean power by 2030, which is an immense amount of taxpayers' money to meet that mission. And I would send a message out to the workforce.
That's not specific to the north east of Scotland and Moray.
Well, GB Energy is based in Aberdeen, and most of the contribution to that clean power mission will come from Scotland. So actually, we should be disproportionate spend will be in Scotland, as has a lot of the UK Government's current legislative programme has a disproportionate effect in Scotland.
Final question, and that's around about succession planning, which we've kind of touched upon already. And you've talked about learning lessons from what has happened in the past. Can I ask you, Secretary of State, what discussions are you having with Scottish Government colleagues, with local authority colleagues, with the enterprise agencies, and probably most importantly, with business, with the private sector, who have invested in city-region deals? What discussions have you had with them around about what has been achieved, what could be achieved, how we export best practice, and how we make sure that we are creating jobs for the future across Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of aspects to that. I mean, I have probably spent more time with the Deputy First Minister in terms of us working together since July the 5th than any other minister of any government, either our own or the Scottish Government. So we're constantly talking about how we deliver this kind of stuff together, because obviously there's devolved and reserved issues, but also the partnership working that you see in the city deals is really important, and that resetting the relationship is not just a political task, it's a task that we both have to do to be able to move forward as partners to deliver for what we seek to deliver when we're in these buildings, and that's what we're mandated to do. So these discussions are going on all the time. We're meeting with COSLA in terms of their input from the local authorities. We're meeting with individual deals, as I've already highlighted. We met with the Edinburgh City Region deal last week with the Deputy First Minister to hear about what their aspirations were for the future. We've met with with Susan Aitken in Glasgow as the lead for the Glasgow region deal in terms of what they want to see for the future. So these discussions are going on all the time, but actually sending out the message from both governments that the economic growth is important. And we want to see that, and that's going to be the driver behind whatever we do, because it's the only way out of this economic problem that we have. Then that's what drives our discussions. But there's forums happening all the time in terms of those discussions, and I hope that the committee's report will play a significant role in drawing some of those issues out and giving some recommendations to both governments that we can look upon as pulling out some of that best practice to see where we go in the future. But I'm very keen that perhaps the term double devolution might be something that people are talking about a lot, because the regions are desperate to get on with doing some of the stuff that's right at the top of all of our agendas in terms of skills and those kinds of issues. And as Ms Slater said, some of the discussions around transport infrastructure is really important, and we need to make sure that we're giving the tools and the money and resources to the region deals to make sure that regional growth is right across the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Kevin, can I follow up on that point, Secretary of State? You hinted that there is clearly a desire from partners to see potentially growth deal 2 because people want to see investment. But you also seem to be suggesting that there may become some sort of permanency within the structures that have been established around the growth deals. Is that the case? I mean, it has been highlighted to the committee that it's quite a cluttered landscape, particularly in Scotland. We've got enterprise agencies, we've got regional economic forums, but you seem to suggest that maybe there is a desire to see those structures within the growth deals continue beyond those particular deals. Is that the case? Is that the feeling you're getting from partners? And I don't want to intervene in the narrative about Edinburgh South being the best place to live, because of course we know that the best place to live is the south of Scotland. That's quite unique when it comes to the growth deals, because it covers more than Scotland. It covers, of course, the north of England as well. So I'm interested to know how that desire to see a more permanency within structures would work potentially across the border.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, because those discussions aren't being instigated by us. They're not our agendas. The particular discussion last week with the Edinburgh City Region partners was instigated by Edinburgh, and the most enthusiastic partners in the room were the smaller councils around the city, because they want to see now that progressing into the relationships that they've built and the working together of how they can now take that economic unit and get more bang for their buck in terms of seeing the region rather than just individual local authorities or the city itself. And I think those are the kinds of discussions that most deals who are now coming to that mature part of their process are looking towards. So the discussions are coming from the deals themselves. In Edinburgh, and City Region deal partners laid out a very strong case for what they want to see in the future, and they're going to work on this stuff regardless. So is that the supporting mechanisms? It is quite a cluttered landscape. I don't think there's a lack of resources around. I mean, there'll be arguments about, resources here and there, but in terms of that landscape of what could be available, GB Energy, National Wealth Fund, Scottish National Investment Bank, deal and partner funding, private investment, inward investment, all of that stuff is on the table. So I think it's a quite exciting future for getting people to work together. And in actual fact, the smaller local authorities in those partnerships are very much bought into that as well, because they are providing the infrastructure for the cities. So their initial concerns that the cities would suck all of this up have actually happened in the opposite way, in the sense that the smaller local authorities have benefited much by having the cities as the linchpins for bringing these deals forward. So I think it's a really, really important question, and it's probably a question for this committee to answer in its report in terms of best practice and what the future should look like. And I had a fiver that by 10:15 you'd have mentioned the A75.
That's my next question, Cabinet Secretary, but I will refrain from that, but we'll definitely pick you up on that issue off the meeting. I think there's a further question from the Deputy Convener.
Just a quick couple of questions, if you don't mind. You mentioned industrial strategy earlier, and the UK Government's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council was formed in late 2024. But I was concerned that despite the recognition that Scotland's at the heart of a net zero future and is, of course, a critical growth sector, there's no Scottish representation on that. Why is that?
There are Scots on the Strategy Council, and we've had long discussions with the Business Secretary, the Business and Trade Secretary, in terms of its remit. But actually, the industrial strategy itself will have Scotland as a major thread through it. So we shouldn't see these bodies as being irrelevant because they don't have direct representation. Because actually, the stuff that they're dealing with in terms of the industrial strategy has a huge Scottish context to it, and it's our
given voice. We've had what was formerly known as the Scottish Council of Development Industry, formed in 1931 with a specific focus on industrial strategies, obviously now known as Prosper, and that, for example, isn't on. It seems utterly bizarre. And in other words, will you commit today to looking at proper Scottish representation to make sure that Scotland is properly at the heart of a net zero future? That's one of the critical growth sectors.
Yeah, as Alistair's just passed to me, Anita Frew, Scottish, who sits on the Strategy Council directly. So what I'm keen to do is the Strategy Council in itself and the industrial strategy has been a very collaborative exercise. And the challenge, of course, as you know, with government is to try and get government to work horizontally rather than vertically. And the industrial strategy is trying to cut through all of that. So that the reason that we have a mission-led government is because the missions aren't about siloed government departments, they're about everyone trying to work together to achieve them. And that's the challenge of of implementing the industrial strategy. So very much like the AI strategy that we spoke about earlier, or indeed GB Energy, or indeed the industrial strategy, the challenge for government now is not to set up the structures or write the reports and walk away. The challenge now is delivery. And that's going to be the key thing that we have to do in all of these aspects over the next 12 to 18 months is delivery, delivery, delivery. Governments are very good at writing reports. They're very, very good at setting up structures. What they're not very good at is delivery. And that's the #1 aim of not just the Strategy Council, but the aim of having a proper industrial strategy.
I completely agree, and that's why I think it's important that the body can deliver through Scotland and not just to Scotland and genuinely have adequate Scottish representation. Just to move on, because I appreciate your time, it's precious, I couldn't let today's session go by without raising the issue of Grangemouth, which of course you'll appreciate is extremely close to my heart. There's been much debate and discussion, but my primary interest remains in the light of what we are seeing going forward and a net zero future, that how we can protect and retain the skills base with whatever transition is put in place, and not just the skills base, that skills cluster, which also includes the important chemical cluster. Can you give a sense of your latest thinking on what the current situation is, just for the record? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to go over the history, but the first time I met Alistair actually was at 9 AM on the Saturday after the election in the Scotland office to get a briefing on what was happening at Grangemouth. Because obviously the decision on the refinery, and I think it's really important to keep emphasising that the Grangemouth site is different from the Grangemouth refinery, because the site is much, much larger and the refinery is a part of it and a very important part of it, but really important to not confuse the two, which I think some of some partners have either done so inadvertently or deliberately. But and the situation at Grangemouth is a tragedy. I mean, the refinery closing is no doubt the worst possible news. But we had, I mean, days, but weeks certainly, in terms of being a new government to try and do something about this. We managed to get the Falkland Grangemouth growth deal over the line. That's sort of the medium term. We managed to get the money in place jointly again with the Scottish Government for Project Willow, which is the long-term view. That should be published shortly, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm sure we all are. And there's a commitment from both governments to see Project Willow as the way forward. And now, it won't be a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. We shouldn't be building up the hopes, particularly of the workforce and the local community, to be that. But actually, it will lay out what the future could look like, and it's up to us now to try and deliver on some of that. Convener, if you don't mind, I would just very briefly say that we had weeks the previous UK government and current Scottish government had 32 years combined. So we did all we possibly could, and it's a travesty that it's closed. I just wish we had more time.
But just to finish off my point about specific actions that you anticipate to protect the skills base during a transition period, that's what I'm asking.
Well, Alistair might be able to add something that's been happening this week.
Yeah, we had a really useful session, Deputy Convener, last week at Forth Valley College. And I think we see a really important aspect of Scotland's office role is to bring together the various interested parties. There's a lot of different strands to Grangemouth. There's the deal, there's the Freeport, and two governments that play the local authority. And skills was absolutely central to that. It's obviously a devolved issue, but some of the same challenges are faced across different parts of the UK, and the Secretary of State heard the same from the defence sector just last week. So I think we're exploring how we can move forward a shared skills agenda, recognising that there's lots of really important skills at that site that could be deployed in other places. And indeed, we've been liaising between other interested businesses and Petro Ineos and Ineos to consider whether they could be taking on some of the staff who sadly will be made redundant. So we're looking at it from the bigger policy perspective, but also in quite a tangible way in terms of making connections and trying to help some of those individual people and their careers.
And the number one thing that I think is worth putting on the record that both the defence industry and the industries around the Grangemouth cluster have been saying is that reskilling is really important, and it's a really important part of the Withers Review. And if we could get the Withers Review, again, governments are very good at writing reports, they're very bad at implementing them. If we get the Withers Review off the shelf, dusted down and implemented, that's what the industries are currently crying out for. And we're very happy to convene and work with the Scottish Government to do what we can to try and get that implemented as quickly as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And we may come back to you on that point, Secretary of State, because I know the committee are keen to do some work around the implementation and the changes on those the skills front. Back to the A75. I'm only joking. I'm only joking. That actually. That does bring us to the end of the first part of our evidence session today. Can I thank the Secretary of State and Alistair MacDonald very much for joining us today. I think it was a very thorough session and one that certainly will make a big contribution to this committee's work on the growth deal. So thank you very much, and I now suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you.